Okay, next up is going to be Arise Alpha, a dark LitRPG adventure written by Jez Cahill. I might be saying the last name wrong. I never actually asked him. It is 382 pages, $5.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. I again did listen to the audiobook version for this, which comes in at 21.5 hours. Here's the author's description. When you steal 100 grand from some very bad people, the best way to survive is to stay small and quiet. Possibly it's not to save a pair of drowning girls, not go viral on social media, and certainly not to let the local police take your passport trapping you on a small party island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. But Steve isn't the average guy. He's ex-military, ex-enforcer, and ex-human. He's a one-man nanite-fueled nightmare for those that cross the line, and he's decided that it's time to clean up his act. He's going to make up for things he's done and save the little guys. It's a nice fantasy, but even he has to admit it's really just a justification, because he's a very bad man with horrifying abilities, and he's only just learning what he's capable of. He needs a reason to not go down the dark, and if that's hunting down the creatures of the night and beating them to death with their own femurs. Well, he's just the man for the job. Stolen money, Greek islands, werewolves, and enforcers. What could possibly go wrong? There we go. Actually, a very nice description of the story. You will note the lack of described RPG progression there, and that's going to be something that kind of draws the story down a little bit. This is a LitRPG story. There is eventually some RPG progression of a kind. The main character, and this like minorly spoiler, but it is necessary to describe the progression system. The progression system reminds it essentially of like the main character gaining nanites from beating foes and like drawing them out of them. And he uses those nanites to develop his own abilities, whether it's going to be like hacking or increasing his ability to convert unprogrammed nanites or corrupted nanites so that they benefit him more, or just like increasing the rate of conversion or his own progression. There's like a ton of things that are related to like espionage and action. Like there's essentially like a bunch of skill tree options in that he has access to, whether it's stealth, action, hacking, ranger stuff, full on protection stuff, whatever the case is. So that exists in the story. This has RPG progression. There are plenty of numbers in there to kind of satisfy most people. However, the points of progression are very. There's a great distance between those points. So there's a lot of story that focuses around the other elements of the story, and then it's like occasion like, oh, here's a progression point. Here's a place where he's leveling up because he's developed enough. But there are kind of, for me at least, a little. I would have let us see more progression frequency, because it almost feels like, oh, every time he's going through a trouble and he can't handle, then there's just like a gigantic power up, and the powers he gets aren't necessarily like really. There is some decision tree making, but a lot of it's just like, oh, these are just cool powers he's going to use or advance or develop. So good stuff, but I wish there was just more of it as a crunchy RPG nerdy kind of guy. Most of the story, however, is very action oriented. I would describe it probably as 70% urban fantasy action adventure story, and then like maybe 10-15% LitRPG, and the rest is just like a bunch of other things that go in there. This is more of an upgrade system the main character uses to defeat his enemies, takes their nanites, and the upgrades are nice, but again, there were just long stretches between some of those upgrade sections for me, including the beginning. I actually recall reading this, trying to read this rather as an ebook when it first came out, and not being able to get past like the first 15-20% because none of it has anything to do with LitRPG or any kind of progression system. So the beginning section is probably the hardest for me as an ebook reader, but as an audiobook listener, the narrator is just entertaining enough where it's like, oh, okay, I could just kind of not zone out, but like not have to worry about RPG stuff because the world description is fine. The characters' voices were brought to life enough that I could just be entertained on that alone until the RPG progression was actually described in the story. But again, that beginning part is probably a little more of a slog as an ebook reader if you're expecting something very LitRPG-ish right away, and it doesn't exist at the beginning of the story. Again, the story itself, good action-focused pacing, big focus definitely towards action with the main character being introduced to a supernatural world that gives decently interesting spin on an explanation for werewolves, vampires, and all the monster lore in the world. Fights are great, and after, I want to say like 20% in the story, they're very regular. Like you see a lot more action up to that point. A lot of the first 10%, it's like just the author just doing the world building, doing the character building for who the main character is, and trying to set up why he would be introduced to this like urban fantasy universe that exists below like the surface of our normal everyday world. I'd probably criticize a little bit just the romantic interest in the story. They felt a little bit forced. And the end of the story was definitely a little, I don't want to say forced, but definitely there's a time jump at the end. I'm never big a fan of time jumps. I understand why the author does it. And the ultimate results were pretty entertaining, but I was like, oh, that's a choice. And it was just a tiny bit annoying when it happened. But by the end, I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool enough that I'm like, okay, push past it, not a big deal. But yeah, a lot of the relationships are just there to give the main character motivation to push the story progression forward sometimes. Overall, though, a really good action-oriented audiobook that I enjoyed. Gets a score of 7.3 out of 10. That's a good score. Slightly below, like, middle of the range good, though, like, just because of the RPG elements not being as richly developed as I hope sometimes, and the beginning being a little frustrating as an ebook reader, because it takes a little while to get to anything resembling an RPG system at all. So knocks a couple decimal points out there, but still, entertaining story. 7.3 out of 10. That's a good score for Alpha Rise, a dark lit RPG adventure.